I never planned on becoming the villain in someone's power trip fantasy. 2 years ago, I was just a municipal judge looking for a peaceful home in a well-maintained neighborhood. After careful consideration, I settled on Oak Ridge Estates, a pleasant community with tree-lined streets, tasteful homes, and what appeared to be a reasonable homeowners association. The HOA keeps everything looking nice, my realtor had assured me, pointing out the immaculate common areas and consistent aesthetic throughout the development. They're reasonable, just the basic stuff to maintain property values. The monthly dues seemed fair for what you got: community pool access, landscaping for common areas, and regular maintenance of shared facilities. I signed the papers without hesitation, excited to join what seemed like a perfect little community. On move-in day, several neighbors brought over welcome baskets, a gesture that confirmed I'd made the right choice. Among them was Diane Richardson, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Diane Richardson, HOA board member," she said, handing me a hefty binder. "Everything you need to know is in here. We have standards in Oak Ridge Estates." She glanced at my moving boxes as if assessing their worthiness. "Trash collection is Thursday morning. Bins must be out by 7 a.m. and back in by evening, not visible from the street otherwise." I thanked her, assuming her businesslike demeanor was just first meeting formality. I couldn't have been more wrong. For the first few months, everything was fine. I followed the rules, attended the occasional HOA meeting when my court schedule allowed, and maintained my property meticulously. What I didn't advertise to everyone was my position as the town's municipal judge. It wasn't a secret exactly. Several immediate neighbors knew, but I've always preferred to keep my professional and personal lives separate. I didn't want special treatment or to be known as the judge rather than just Michael. Little did I know, this separation of identities would set the stage for a confrontation that neither I nor the soon-to-be notorious HOA Karen would ever forget. It began on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday when I returned home from court to find a neon orange notice stuck to my windshield. A notice that would trigger a series of events culminating in the most satisfying moment of neighborhood justice I've ever witnessed. Diane Richardson hadn't always been the neighborhood menace. When I first moved in, she was just one voice on the 5-member HOA board. The president at the time was a retired architect named Gerald, who took a measured, reasonable approach to community governance. Under his leadership, the HOA functioned as intended, maintaining common areas, organizing seasonal events, and addressing legitimate concerns. Everything changed when Gerald and his wife decided to relocate to Arizona to be closer to their grandchildren. The special election to replace him should have been a minor neighborhood event. Only about 20 homeowners bothered to show up for the vote. Diane won by a margin of 3 votes, and that's when the transformation began. Within months, the quarterly HOA newsletter doubled in size, primarily filled with friendly reminders about rules that had rarely been enforced. The annual HOA dues increased by 15% to cover administrative costs and enhanced community monitoring. Board meetings, once cordial 90-minute affairs, stretched into 3-hour sessions dominated by Diane's meticulous reports of covenant violations. My first direct encounter with Diane's new leadership style came 6 months after her election, when I received a written warning about my garbage can being visible from the street. I had placed it behind a row of decorative shrubs, but apparently, if you stood at precisely the right angle at the corner of my property, you could catch a glimpse of the lid. I complied without complaint, constructing a small wooden enclosure that satisfied the requirements. "That's how it starts," my neighbor Tom warned me as he helped me build the enclosure. "First, you get the friendly warning. Then come the fines. Diane's on a power trip, and it's getting worse." Tom wasn't exaggerating. In the following months, I witnessed a parade of increasingly petty enforcement actions. The Rodriguez family was cited for having their teenage son's friend's car parked in their driveway overnight. Mrs. Pep Kapoor received a violation notice for wind chimes that exceeded the acceptable noise level. The Johnsons were fined when their mailbox paint faded to a slightly different shade of Navajo white than the approved color code. Each incident followed the same pattern. Diane would personally document the violation with photographs and measurements, present her findings at the board meeting, and push through her recommended penalty, while the other board members, now effectively her rubber stamps, nodded along. Through it all, I kept my head down and played by the rules. My position as a judge made me particularly sensitive to the importance of following established regulations, even when I found them excessive. I had seen firsthand how community disputes could escalate into legal battles that benefited no one but the attorneys involved. Besides, I was busy enough with my courtroom docket without adding neighborhood drama to my plate. That strategy worked until the summer heat wave hit our town, and with it, a perfect storm of circumstances that would bring Diane and me into direct conflict. The trouble began with a water main break on my side of the street. City crews arrived early on a Monday morning, tearing up the asphalt and setting up barriers that blocked access to our driveways. The foreman, a gruff but apologetic man named Ray, informed us that repairs would take at least 3 days. "We've arranged for affected residents to park in the community center lot," he explained, handing out temporary parking permits. "Should be wrapped up by Thursday, Friday at the latest." The community center was about a 5-minute walk from my house, inconvenient, but manageable. I moved my car as instructed and adjusted my routine, leaving a bit earlier each morning to accommodate the extra walking time to and from my vehicle. What I didn't know was that our HOA had recently amended its parking regulations. The previous rule simply stated that residents couldn't park on the street overnight. The new amendment, buried in page 17 of the latest 30-page newsletter, specified that temporary parking accommodations must be approved by the board with 72 hours notice, except in cases of documented medical emergency. By Wednesday evening, the water main repairs were taking longer than expected. The crew had encountered unexpected complications, something about century-old clay pipes that weren't on the city plans. As I returned home from work, Ray informed me they'd need at least 2 more days. "Sorry about this, folks," he said to the gathered homeowners. "We've extended your parking permits through the weekend just to be safe." That should have been the end of it, a minor inconvenience in suburban life. But Diane Richardson saw an opportunity. Thursday morning, I left for the courthouse at my usual time, walking to the community center lot where my car had been safely parked for 3 days. As I approached, I immediately noticed something was wrong. A bright orange paper was stuck to my windshield, the same color as the HOA violation notices. Puzzled, I removed it and read, "Violation, unauthorized extended parking. Vehicle will be towed at owner's expense if not removed within 24 hours, by order of Oak Ridge Estates HOA Board." The notice had yesterday's date and Diane's flowing signature at the bottom. I stood there, blinking at the paper in disbelief. The city crews had explicitly arranged for us to park here during the repairs. I had a valid temporary permit clearly displayed on my dashboard. There was no logical reason for this notice. As I contemplated my next move, I heard the distinctive sound of a camera shutter. Looking up, I saw Diane standing near the lot entrance, smartphone raised, apparently documenting my violation for HOA records. When she noticed me watching, she quickly lowered the phone and strode purposefully in my direction. "Good morning, Mr. Stewart," she said with artificial pleasantness. "I see you found our notice." "I have," I replied evenly, "though I'm confused about why it's there. The city arranged for affected residents to park here during the water main repairs. I have their permit right on my dashboard." Diane's smile tightened. "City permits don't override HOA regulations. According to our covenant, Section 12.4, residents must obtain board approval for any temporary parking accommodations. The city should have coordinated with us before making these arrangements." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I deal with difficult people daily in my courtroom. "This is clearly an emergency situation, Diane. The city is repairing essential infrastructure." "A water main break is an inconvenience, not an emergency," she countered. "An emergency would be if you were personally experiencing a medical crisis. The board would have gladly approved proper requests with the required notice." There was no time for 72 hours notice. The water main broke Monday morning. Poor planning on the city's part doesn't constitute an emergency on ours. She gestured to the parking lot. Regardless, you now have 24 hours to move your vehicle before it's towed at your expense. And where exactly should I move it? I asked, struggling to maintain my composure. My driveway is blocked by construction equipment. That's not the HOA's concern, she replied with a dismissive wave. Perhaps you could park at a friend's house or rent a temporary space at the storage facility on Highway 16. With that, she turned and walked away, already pulling out her phone to document the next violation in the row of cars belonging to my equally inconvenienced neighbors. I checked my watch. Court was scheduled to begin in 40 minutes, and I had a full docket that morning. This would have to wait. I removed the notice, folded it carefully into my briefcase, and drove to work, my mind already cycling through possible approaches to resolve this situation reasonably. What I didn't realize then was that reason had very little to do with what was coming next. That evening, I returned to find an additional notice on my windshield. This one was more ominous. Final warning: vehicle scheduled for towing tomorrow at 9 a.m. All towing and administrative fees, $275 minimum, will be charged to homeowner's account. I'd had enough. After changing out of my court attire, I walked the 3 blocks to Diane's house, notice in hand, determined to resolve this rationally. Her immaculate Tudor-style home was easily identifiable by the elaborate seasonal wreath on the front door and the perfectly symmetrical potted topiaries flanking the entrance. I rang the doorbell and waited, hearing the faint sounds of a television from within. After a moment, the porch light switched on, and Diane opened the door. Her expression shifted from neutral to slightly smug when she recognized me. "Mr. Stewart," she said, making no move to invite me in. "What can I do for you this evening?" "I'd like to discuss these parking notices," I said, holding up the papers. "There seems to be a misunderstanding about the situation." Diane crossed her arms. "There's no misunderstanding. The covenant is quite clear about parking regulations. The city has explicitly arranged this temporary solution during the water main repairs," I explained. "They've issued permits and designated the community center lot for affected residents. The city does not have authority over our HOA covenant," she repeated, as if speaking to a child. "The board alone grants exceptions to our rules. This is clearly a case of necessary accommodation during infrastructure repairs. It's temporary and affects multiple households," I said, maintaining an even tone, the same one I used with difficult litigants in my courtroom. "Surely the board can recognize this as a reasonable exception." "The board," Diane said with a thin smile, "has already reviewed the situation this afternoon and voted to uphold the violation notices." This surprised me. "You called an emergency board meeting without notifying affected homeowners?" "It was an email vote, perfectly allowed under our bylaws for time-sensitive matters." She glanced at her watch. "Now, if there's nothing else, I have dinner plans." I tried one more approach. "Diane, I've been nothing but cooperative with all HOA regulations since moving here. This situation is beyond my control, beyond any resident's control. The reasonable thing would be to grant a temporary exception until the city completes its repairs. Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Stewart. If we make an exception for you, we'd have to make exceptions for everyone." She began to close the door. "Your car will be towed at 9 a.m. tomorrow unless moved. Have a good evening." As the door closed in my face, I stood there for a moment, genuinely stunned by the absurdity of the situation. In my years as a judge, I'd encountered all manner of unreasonable behavior, but this level of inflexible rule enforcement for its own sake was exceptional. Walking back home, I weighed my options. I could attempt to contact other board members directly, but if they'd already voted to support Diane's position, that seemed unlikely to succeed. I could try to reach someone at the City Public Works Department to intervene, but it was already after hours. I could move my car to a commercial parking lot several miles away, but that would create significant hardship for getting to work. Or, I realized, I could finally let Diane discover exactly who she was dealing with. By the time I reached my house, I had made my decision. I would not move my car. Instead, I would be present tomorrow at 9 a.m. when the tow truck arrived, and I would handle this matter the way I handled disputes in my courtroom, with a calm citation of the relevant law. What Diane Richardson didn't know What she had never bothered to discover about her neighbors, beyond their compliance with her precious covenant, was that as the municipal judge, I was intimately familiar with the city ordinances regarding emergency infrastructure repairs and temporary parking accommodations. And those ordinances superseded any homeowners association regulations, regardless of what Diane believed. The stage was set for our final confrontation. I slept surprisingly well that night, knowing that sometimes justice requires standing your ground. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Instead of my usual routine of heading to the courthouse early, I had arranged for a colleague to handle my 9:30 a.m. hearing. I dressed more formally than usual for a Friday. A tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and my favorite navy tie with subtle silver pinstripes. Not my judicial robes, of course, but clothing that conveyed a certain authority nonetheless. At 8:45 a.m., I walked to the community center parking lot and leaned casually against my car, briefcase at my feet. I wasn't the only one who had decided to make a stand. 3 other neighbors, whose driveways were also blocked by the water main repairs, had gathered near their vehicles. We exchanged nods of solidarity. "Judge Stewart," called Tom from across the lot. "You're fighting this too?" "Seems like the reasonable thing to do," I replied. Mary Rodriguez joined our small group. "This is ridiculous. My husband had to take an Uber to work yesterday because he was afraid our car would be towed if he drove it." "Diane's gone too far this time," added elderly Mr. Kapoor, who had walked over from his house with the aid of his cane, using a necessary repair as an excuse for her power games. At precisely 8:58 a.m., a familiar figure appeared at the entrance to the parking lot. Diane Richardson was dressed in what I'd come to think of as her official HOA uniform: beige slacks, a pastel cardigan, and sensible shoes that somehow still managed to click authoritatively as she approached. She carried a clipboard and was accompanied by a young man I recognized as her assistant from the HOA office. She faltered slightly upon seeing our assembled group, but quickly recovered her composure. "Good morning," she said briskly. "I see you've all decided to make this difficult." "We've decided to stand up for what's reasonable," Tom replied. Diane ignored him, instead making a show of checking her watch. "The towing company should be here momentarily. I've authorized removal of all vehicles still in violation." She turned to her assistant. "Make sure you document everything for our records." As if on cue, a large tow truck rumbled into the lot entrance. It was from Valley Towing, a company I was familiar with from various impoundment cases that had come through my court. The driver, a burly man named Mike, whom I'd seen testify in several cases, climbed down from the cab and approached our group with a clipboard of his own. "Morning, folks," he said, glancing uncomfortably between us and Diane. "I've got orders to remove unauthorized vehicles from this lot." "These vehicles are not unauthorized," I stated calmly, stepping forward. "They are here with explicit permission from the City Public Works Department during emergency infrastructure repairs." Diane cut in quickly. "The HOA has final authority over this parking area, and none of these vehicles have proper HOA authorization." Mike looked uncertain. "Look, I just go where I'm told and tow what's on my work order." "May I see that work order?" I asked politely. As Mike handed me his clipboard, Diane stepped between us. "This is HOA business, Mr. Stewart. You have no authority to interfere." It was at this moment that Mrs. Abernathy, a retired school principal who lived in the house adjacent to the community center, walked over to join our growing assembly of residents. "Morning, Judge Stewart," she said loudly. "Unusual to see you in the neighborhood at this hour. No court today?" There was a brief silence. I could almost see the gears turning in Diane's head as she processed this new information. "Judge?" she repeated, looking at me with newfound uncertainty. "Municipal Judge Michael Stewart," Mrs. Abernathy confirmed cheerfully, apparently unaware of the tension. "One of the youngest judges ever appointed in our district. We're quite proud to have him in our neighborhood." Mike from Valley Towing straightened up immediately. "Judge Stewart? From Municipal Court?" "The same," I acknowledged with a slight nod. "Good to see you outside the courtroom, Mike." Diane's face had gone through a remarkable transformation, from righteous indignation to confusion to the dawning horror of recognition. "You're the municipal judge?" "For the past 8 years," I confirmed. and in that capacity, I'm quite familiar with City Ordinance 47.3, which states that during emergency infrastructure repairs, affected residents must be provided with alternative parking accommodations, and that these city-authorized accommodations supersede any private property restrictions, including those of homeowners associations. Mike was already backing toward his truck. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'll need to call my dispatcher to clarify the situation. That seems wise, I agreed, returning his clipboard. Diane had recovered enough to attempt one last assertion of authority. Ordinance or not, our covenant clearly states, Section 3 of that same ordinance, I continued as if she hadn't spoken, specifically prohibits the towing of vehicles with valid city emergency permits, classifying such action as unlawful interference with essential public works. The potential penalties include fines up to $2,000 per incident. By now, several more neighbors had drifted over, attracted by the unusual gathering. The water main repair crew had also paused their work to watch the confrontation unfold. Ray, the foreman, stood at the edge of the group with his arms crossed, a slight smile visible beneath his hard hat. Furthermore, I added, reaching into my briefcase and extracting a document, I took the liberty last night of obtaining an emergency injunction from the court prohibiting the removal of any vehicle displaying a valid city public works permit from this lot until the completion of the water main repairs. This was, in fact, completely true. I had contacted a colleague on the bench the previous evening and explained the situation. The injunction had been signed and delivered to my email just before midnight. I handed the document to Diane, whose hands trembled slightly as she took it. You'll note it's been properly filed with the court clerk, and copies have been provided to Valley Towing's business office and the city attorney. Mike was already on his phone, presumably confirming this information with his dispatcher. After a brief conversation, he snapped his phone shut and called over to us. Sorry for the confusion, folks. There's been a change of plans. We won't be towing any vehicles today. He climbed back into his truck without a backward glance at Diane. As the tow truck rumbled out of the parking lot, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the gathered neighbors. Diane stood frozen, the injunction clutched in her hand, her face a mask of thwarted authority. I think we're done here, I said quietly. I need to get to court for my afternoon docket. As I picked up my briefcase and turned to leave, Diane finally found her voice. This isn't over, Judge Stewart. The board will be reviewing this incident at our next meeting. I paused and turned back to her. I look forward to attending. I've been meaning to get more involved in our community governance. With that, I walked to my car, leaving Diane standing alone amidst a crowd of residents who were no longer quite so intimidated by her clipboard and rulebook. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about the confrontation at the community center parking lot, transforming what would normally have been a sparsely attended gathering into standing room only. Every seat in the community center's meeting room was filled, with additional residents lining the walls. I arrived a few minutes early, dressed casually but neatly in slacks and a button-down shirt, intentionally not wearing a suit to avoid any appearance of trying to intimidate with my professional position. Several neighbors nodded or smiled as I entered, a few even patting me on the shoulder as I made my way to an empty chair in the third row. At precisely 7 p.m., the side door opened and the HOA board members filed in. Diane led the procession, her face determinedly neutral as she took her seat at the center of the table. The other 4 board members, 2 of whom I knew casually, 2 I had never met, appeared distinctly uncomfortable with the unusual attendance. Good evening, Diane began, her voice only slightly less confident than usual. This emergency session of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Board is now called to order. We have one agenda item tonight, to address the recent incident regarding parking violations during the water main repairs. She shuffled through some papers, visibly composing herself before continuing. Before we open the floor for discussion, I want to clarify the board's position. While we recognize the inconvenience caused by the city's repairs, our covenant clearly states that all temporary parking accommodations must receive prior board approval. This rule exists for the safety and security of our community." A low murmur ran through the audience. Diane raised her voice slightly to continue. "However, in light of the unusual circumstances, the board has decided to temporarily suspend enforcement of this regulation until the completion of the current repairs." This announcement was met with scattered applause, which Diane quickly tried to quell with a raised hand. "This is a one-time exception based on the specific situation. The requirement for board approval will resume immediately following the completion of repairs." She appeared ready to move on, perhaps hoping to close the meeting quickly, when an elderly man near the front raised his hand. "I'd like to understand something, if I may." Diane nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Mr. Howell? If the city issues permits for emergency parking, do those not take precedence over HOA rules?" Judge Stewart seemed to indicate they do. All eyes turned to me, and Diane's lips thinned into a tight line. Perhaps Judge Stewart would care to address this question, since he seems to have appointed himself an expert on the matter. It was a tactical error on her part, inviting me to speak. I stood and turned to face the room rather than just the board. "I'm happy to clarify," I began. "City Ordinance 47.3, enacted 15 years ago, specifically addresses this situation. When the city declares an infrastructure emergency, which a water main break certainly qualifies as, they have the authority to establish temporary accommodations that supersede private property restrictions." I kept my tone conversational and educational rather than confrontational. This isn't about the HOA losing authority. It's about a clear legal hierarchy that exists for practical reasons. During emergencies, the city needs to be able to act quickly without navigating the approval processes of every private organization within its jurisdiction. One of the board members, a retired attorney named Richard, whom I knew from professional circles, leaned forward. "Would you say the HOA was acting unlawfully, then, in attempting to enforce its regulations?" It was a fair question, and I considered my response carefully. I would say the HOA was attempting to enforce a regulation that, in this specific circumstance, was superseded by municipal authority. It's less about lawfulness and more about jurisdiction. The HOA has legitimate authority within its sphere, but that sphere has legal boundaries. Diane, clearly unhappy with losing control of the narrative, interjected. "While this legal discussion is fascinating, the fact remains that our covenant, which every homeowner signs, explicitly requires board approval for temporary parking accommodations. If that conflicts with some obscure city ordinance, perhaps the ordinance should be revised." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. "Actually, I believe there's a more fundamental issue at play here. Section 8.2 of the Oak Ridge Estates Covenant itself states that all regulations contained herein are subject to applicable municipal, county, and state laws. This clause is standard in HOA agreements precisely because they exist within a broader legal framework." Murmurs of interest rippled through the room as several homeowners flipped through their copies of the covenant to verify my citation. I continued, "Additionally, the recent amendment to the parking regulation, requiring 72 hours notice for temporary accommodations, was enacted without the required two-thirds homeowner vote mandated by Section 2.4 of the Covenant for any rule changes that affect property access." This statement caused a stir. Many residents exchanged confused glances, clearly unaware of this requirement. "That's simply not true," Diane said sharply. "The board has authority to amend regulations related to common areas without a general vote. For cosmetic or maintenance changes, yes," I agreed, "but not for rules that materially affect homeowners' ability to access their properties or that impose new financial penalties. The covenant is quite clear on that distinction." Richard, the attorney on the board, was frowning now. He leaned over to whisper something to Diane, who shook her head firmly in response. Another resident stood up. "Are you saying the parking rule change wasn't properly enacted in the first place?" "I'm saying," I replied carefully, "that there's a legitimate question about whether proper procedure was followed. Section 2.4 requires not only a two-thirds vote for such changes, but also certified mail notification to all homeowners at least 30 days prior to the vote. I never received such a notification, and based on the reaction in this room, I suspect others didn't either." The The meeting erupted into multiple conversations as homeowners discussed this revelation among themselves. Diane banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "This is outrageous," she finally declared when the noise had subsided somewhat. "You're undermining the authority of the board based on a technicality." "I believe," I responded evenly, "that in matters of governance, what you call technicalities are what others might call rights and due process. The covenant exists to protect all homeowners, including from potential overreach by the board itself." At this point, Richard cleared his throat loudly and addressed Diane. "I think we should adjourn to executive session to discuss these matters privately before proceeding." Diane looked as though she wanted to object, but instead nodded stiffly. "This meeting will take a 15-minute recess while the board confers." As the board members filed out through the side door, the room buzzed with conversation. Several homeowners approached me with questions about other recent rule changes, and I found myself explaining basic concepts of governance and due process to my neighbors. When the board returned, the change in dynamics was immediately apparent. Richard, not Diane, took the central seat at the table. "After careful consideration," he announced, "the board has determined that there are procedural questions regarding certain recent rule amendments that require further legal review. Until such review is completed, we will revert to the previous version of all regulations changed within the past 12 months." He continued over Diane's visible displeasure. "Additionally, all pending violations and fines related to the water main repair parking situation are hereby rescinded. The board will establish a committee to review our covenant enforcement procedures to ensure they comply with both our own governing documents and applicable laws." The meeting concluded with a motion to establish this review committee, with 5 volunteer homeowners, including myself, nominated to serve alongside 2 board members. Notably, Diane didn't volunteer, though her tight-lipped expression throughout the voting process spoke volumes. As the meeting adjourned and people began to disperse, Tom approached me with a wide grin. "Judge Stewart, you just accomplished what 3 years of complaints couldn't. You got the board to actually follow its own rules." "I didn't do anything special," I demurred. "I just pointed out what was already in the covenant." "Maybe," Mary Rodriguez said, joining our conversation, "but you did it with the authority of someone who understands the law, not just as another frustrated homeowner whose concerns could be dismissed." As we walked toward the exit, Richard caught up with me. "A word, if you don't mind, Judge?" He guided me slightly away from the departing crowd. "That was quite a performance," he said quietly. "Though I suspect you didn't share everything you know about potential legal vulnerabilities in how the board has been operating." I raised an eyebrow. I focused on the issues directly relevant to the situation at hand. He nodded knowingly. "I thought as much. For what it's worth, some of us on the board have been uncomfortable with the direction things have been taking. Diane can be persuasive when she wants something, and it was easier to go along than to create conflict. Governance is rarely easy," I acknowledged, "but it does require adherence to established processes." "Indeed," he sighed. "I imagine we'll be seeing more of you at future meetings?" I smiled slightly. "I believe civic participation is an important responsibility." As Richard walked away, I caught sight of Diane standing alone near her car in the parking lot, watching the departing homeowners with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met briefly across the distance, and I offered a small, polite nod. After a moment's hesitation, she returned it stiffly before getting into her car and driving away. The water main repairs were completed 2 days later, and life in Oak Ridge Estates began to return to normal, though it was a slightly different normal than before. The incident had awakened something in our community, an awareness that rules existed to serve the residents, not the other way around, and that even in the small-scale governance of a homeowners association, the principles of due process and legal hierarchy still mattered. The weeks following what came to be known in neighborhood shorthand as the parking standoff brought subtle but significant changes to life in Oak Ridge Estates. The most immediate effect was a noticeable decrease in violation notices. Where the community bulletin board had typically displayed at least a dozen orange citations each week, now there were rarely more than 1 or 2, and those were for clear, substantial violations rather than technical infractions. The Covenant Review Committee, on which I served along with 4 other homeowners and 2 board members, Richard and a retired school administrator named Helen, met weekly to evaluate the HOA's rules and enforcement procedures. Our first official action was to reinstate the original parking regulation, which simply prohibited overnight street parking without special permission, a rule that had worked perfectly well for the neighborhood's first 15 years. Diane maintained her position as board president, but her approach had undeniably shifted. She still attended every meeting, clipboard in hand, but her interventions were more measured, her tone less imperious. Whether this change stemmed from a genuine reconsideration of her leadership style or merely pragmatic adaptation to the new reality, I couldn't say. Either way, the effect on community harmony was positive. For my part, I found myself more engaged in neighborhood affairs than I had ever intended to be. Neighbors began to approach me with questions about various aspects of the covenant, seeking to understand their rights and responsibilities more clearly. I was careful to maintain an educational rather than adversarial approach, explaining legal concepts in accessible terms without encouraging unnecessary conflict. About a month after the confrontation, I arrived home from court to find an unexpected envelope in my mailbox. It contained a formal letter on HOA letterhead, acknowledging that the attempted towing of my vehicle had been inconsistent with established legal precedents, and offering an apology for the inconvenience and concern it had caused. The letter was signed by all 5 board members, including Diane, though I suspected Richard had been the driving force behind it. I was putting away groceries that evening when my doorbell rang. Opening the front door, I was surprised to find Diane Richardson standing on my porch, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Judge Stewart," she began formally, "do you have a moment?" "Of course," I replied, stepping back to invite her in. "And please, it's just Michael at home." She entered hesitantly, declining my offer of tea or coffee, and we sat in my living room in a moment of awkward silence. "I received the board's letter," I said, hoping to ease the tension. "It wasn't necessary, but I appreciate the gesture." Diane straightened almost imperceptibly. "It was necessary. Richard insisted that we put it in writing, and he was right to do so." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I owe you a personal apology as well." This surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. "Nevertheless, it's due," she said with a crispness that reminded me of her usual manner, though without the underlying hostility. "I've been reflecting on my approach to HOA leadership, and I recognize that I've sometimes been overzealous in my enforcement of the covenant." I nodded, but remained silent, giving her space to continue. "When I joined the board 3 years ago, property values in the neighborhood had declined slightly. There had been some neglected properties, some disregard for standards." Her hands fidgeted slightly with the strap of her purse. "My background is in corporate compliance. I'm used to clear rules and consistent enforcement. I thought that was what Oak Ridge Estates needed." "Rules and standards do serve a purpose," I acknowledged. "They help maintain the quality of life that drew all of us to this neighborhood in the first place." "Yes, but," she hesitated, seeming to struggle with what came next. "But I lost sight of the fact that the purpose of rules is to serve the community, not to control it. I became so focused on enforcement that I stopped considering whether the enforcement itself was reasonable or beneficial." This moment of self-awareness surprised me. In my years on the bench, I'd seen how rarely people in positions of authority willingly acknowledged overreach. "What changed your perspective?" I asked. Diane smiled thinly. "Besides the public embarrassment of trying to tow a judge's car, the review committee's preliminary report was illuminating. I hadn't realized how many of our recent rule changes had been implemented without proper procedure." She shook her head. "I prided myself on following the rules, yet I had been bending them to suit my vision of what the neighborhood should be." "It's an easy trap to fall into," I said, thinking of some of my newer colleagues on the bench who sometimes confused their authority with their mission. "When you're responsible for enforcing standards, it's tempting to see the standards themselves as the end goal rather than the means to a better community." "Precisely." She met my eyes directly for perhaps the first time in our acquaintance. I'm not resigning from the board. I still believe I have something to contribute. But I wanted you to know that I've heard the message and I'm committed to a more balanced approach going forward. After she left, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected vulnerabilities she had shown. It reminded me of something I often told new judges. The true measure of authority isn't how strictly you can enforce rules, but how wisely you can apply them to serve justice. The Covenant Review Committee completed its work 2 months later, producing a streamlined set of regulations that preserved necessary standards while eliminating the more intrusive or arbitrary restrictions that had accumulated over time. The revised covenant was approved by an overwhelming majority of homeowners at a special meeting that had the highest attendance in the HOA's history. The following spring, when board elections came around again, Diane chose not to run for president, instead standing for a regular board position. Richard was elected president, with Mary Rodriguez as vice president, a leadership change that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Diane continued to serve on the landscaping committee, where her attention to detail proved valuable rather than oppressive. As for me, I declined nominations for the board, preferring to maintain some separation between my professional and personal lives. I did, however, agree to serve as an advisor to the board on procedural matters, helping to ensure that future rule changes followed proper protocols. It's been a year since the morning when Diane Richardson tried to have my car towed from the community center parking lot. Looking back, I can see how that confrontation, uncomfortable as it was at the time, ultimately benefited our neighborhood in ways none of us could have anticipated. The incident highlighted something I've observed repeatedly in both my professional and personal life. Rules are necessary for communal living, but they must be applied with judgment and humanity. A strict reading of the HOA covenant might have justified the parking violation notice, but any reasonable interpretation of the situation, a city-declared emergency, official alternative arrangements, temporary inconvenience affecting multiple homeowners, called for flexibility rather than rigid enforcement. This balance between rules and reason is something I grapple with daily in my courtroom. The law provides necessary structure and predictability, but its application requires discernment. A judge who merely mechanically applies statutes without considering context or proportionality isn't serving justice. They're merely processing cases. Similarly, Diane's approach to HOA governance had prioritized technical compliance over community welfare. In her mind, a quarter-inch of lawn height or the precise placement of a garbage can had become more important than neighborly relations or reasonable accommodation. She had forgotten that the ultimate purpose of the HOA wasn't to enforce rules, but to maintain a pleasant, harmonious living environment. I've noticed that this tendency toward rigid rule enforcement often emerges from a place of insecurity. People who are uncertain about their authority or effectiveness frequently compensate by becoming inflexible. They fear that any exception or compromise will undermine their position entirely. It takes a certain confidence to be reasonable, to recognize that judicious flexibility strengthens rather than weakens authority. This insight has informed my own judicial philosophy. When new judges observe my courtroom, they sometimes comment on my willingness to consider extenuating circumstances or to fashion creative solutions within the bounds of the law. Doesn't that undermine respect for the rules? They ask. I always respond that true respect comes not from blind enforcement, but from fair application, from rules that serve people rather than subjugate them. The HOA confrontation also reinforced for me the value of knowing your rights and the proper channels for asserting them. Many of my neighbors had simply accepted Diane's interpretations of the covenant without question, assuming that as board president, her understanding was definitive. They hadn't realized that the covenant itself contained procedural protections against overreach, or that municipal ordinances created boundaries around HOA authority. This knowledge gap exists in many contexts. I frequently see litigants in my courtroom who have accepted unfair treatment from landlords, employers, or government agencies because they didn't know they could challenge it or didn't understand the proper process for doing so. Access to justice begins with awareness of rights, which is why I've become more involved in community legal education programs over the past year. Perhaps the most personal lesson from the experience was about the value of community engagement. Like many busy professionals, I had initially approached neighborhood life with a certain detachment. I paid my dues, maintained my property, and attended the occasional event, but I wasn't truly invested in the community's governance or development. The parking incident forced me to engage more deeply, and in doing so, I discovered connections and satisfactions I hadn't anticipated. The monthly neighborhood potlucks that Richard initiated after becoming HOA president have become a highlight of my social calendar. The community garden that replaced an underutilized corner of the common area, a project that Diane now coordinates with unexpected enthusiasm, provides both fresh produce and a natural gathering place for neighbors. The annual block party, once a sparsely attended obligation, has transformed into a genuinely festive occasion that residents actively look forward to. These changes didn't result directly from the confrontation, of course, but they emerged from the shift in neighborhood dynamics that followed it, a movement from rule-centered to community-centered governance. The incident served as a catalyst, reawakening residents' sense of ownership and participation in our shared environment. As for my relationship with Diane, it has evolved in ways neither of us could have predicted. There's a certain mutual respect that has developed, born perhaps from our shared experience of the confrontation and its aftermath. We'll never be close friends. Our personalities and perspectives remain too different for that, but we interact with a civil cordiality that occasionally verges on warmth. Last month, when the city announced plans to replace the aging playground equipment in the park adjacent to our neighborhood, Diane and I found ourselves serving together on the Community Advisory Committee. During one meeting, as we were reviewing safety specifications for the new equipment, she leaned over and whispered, "I'm applying the spirit of the rules here, not just the letter. Progress, wouldn't you say?" I couldn't help but smile at her self-awareness. Substantial progress. I agreed. The morning my car didn't get towed turned out to be more consequential than I could have imagined when I first saw that orange violation notice on my windshield. What began as a simple dispute over parking during an infrastructure repair evolved into a pivotal moment for our neighborhood, a recalibration of power, purpose, and community identity. I've presided over cases involving HOA disputes throughout my judicial career, witnessing firsthand how these seemingly minor conflicts can escalate into bitter legal battles that tear communities apart. Neighbors who once brought each other holiday cookies end up giving depositions against one another. Families sell homes they love to escape the toxicity. Board members face personal liability suits for decisions made with good intentions but poor judgment. What made our situation different was the willingness, ultimately, of all involved to step back from the brink of such conflict. Diane could have doubled down on her authority, rallied her supporters on the board, and created a permanently fractured neighborhood. The residents, emboldened by the successful challenge to her parking enforcement, could have pursued a vindictive campaign to remove her entirely from community governance. I could have leveraged my professional position to embarrass rather than educate. Instead, we found a path toward resolution that acknowledged both the legitimate need for community standards and the equally legitimate need for reasonable, transparent governance. This balance didn't emerge overnight. It required months of committee meetings, sometimes difficult conversations, and gradual rebuilding of trust. But the result has been a neighborhood that functions not just as a collection of properties governed by a covenant, but as a genuine community where people look out for one another. Last week, I returned home from court to find an elderly couple standing bewildered on the sidewalk near their car, clearly lost. They were trying to locate their grandson's new house, but had the address slightly wrong. Without hesitation, I invited them in for cold drinks while I made a few calls to neighbors, eventually identifying their grandson's correct address on the next street over. As they were leaving, the gentleman remarked, "What a friendly neighborhood this is. Jeffrey made a good choice moving here." "We think so," I replied. "It's not perfect, but we work at it. And that, perhaps, is the essence of what I learned from my confrontation with our HOA Karen. Communities, like courtrooms, function best when rules serve people rather than dominate them, when authority is exercised with discretion rather than rigidity, and when governance is viewed as a responsibility rather than a privilege. The fact that Diane Richardson tried to tow my car without realizing I was the town judge makes for an amusing anecdote, the kind of story that guarantees attention when shared at dinner parties or professional gatherings. But the real story isn't about the momentary satisfaction of seeing someone's overreach checked by unexpected authority. It's about what happened afterward, how a neighborhood transformed a potential breaking point into an opportunity for growth and renewal. As a judge, I'm often asked about my most memorable cases. Typically, people expect stories of dramatic criminal trials or landmark civil decisions. But increasingly, I find myself thinking about that orange parking violation notice and the morning I stood in a community center parking lot, watching the gradual dawn of recognition on Diane Richardson's face as she realized exactly who she was dealing with. Not because it was a moment of personal triumph, but because it was a reminder that justice doesn't always wear robes or sit behind a bench. Sometimes it emerges quietly in everyday interactions, in the small choices to balance principles with compassion, rules with reason, and authority with humanity. And sometimes, just sometimes, it starts with a water main break and an HOA Karen who picked exactly the wrong car to try to tow.